This is a COSI event. This is really nice for me to do this as COSI is winding down, because I gave a COSI talk, I believe, wow, I can't believe it was, I think, almost 5 years ago, on some research that we had just completed and at that time. And so it's great to come back and come back to this event and talk to you again about some of the things we've been doing more recently. The other nice thing about the COSI program is we had interns through IRSC, and it was a great program. So we've had a really nice relationship with the COSI program. What I'd like to talk to you about is some of the habitat restoration work that we've been doing just in the last couple years or so. We've really been doing oyster restoration since even going back to before I started working at Florida Oceanographic, back to about 2006, 2007, where we recruited volunteers to grow oysters in cages off their docks as a part of a estuary-wide in the St. Lucie River and the Southern Indian River Lagoon oyster gardening project. And that was kind of our gateway into oyster restoration in terms of building reefs. And so when I started at Florida Oceanographic in 2008, that was actually the first project I took on, was to continue a project where we were planning to do reef restoration. And then so that was sort of my start at Florida Oceanographic. And I came over from the west coast of Florida at Florida Gulf Coast University, where we had a pretty active oyster reef restoration program for a number of years. So I had that experience. And the one thing that's important about this title is this community-based. Community-based means we really engage and involve the community, which means you. So a lot of our work is accomplished, and in almost all cases cannot be accomplished without the aid of community support, namely volunteers that actually help us build these kinds of reefs that you see here. These are all restored reefs. This is in downtown Stuart, and we started that site in about 2011, and so they're about the oldest reefs are about 6 years old. And the neat thing about these reefs is these pretty much look like, when you look at the clusters of oysters, they pretty much resemble natural oyster reefs. So this has been a pretty successful site, and I'll get into some of the challenges that this site has faced. We have thousands of volunteers that have helped us with these projects, but I'd also like to acknowledge some of the funding agencies that have helped us accomplish a lot of this work. The last year and a half, we had funding support from the Florida DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, and then smaller grants from South Florida Water Management District, the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, which is a very important program for our Indian River Lagoon, and Martin County. Actually, our relationship with Martin County goes all the way back for years, and a lot of this work was accomplished with support from Martin County. More recently, we've also received some support from the Coastal Conservation Association and the fishing clubs, local fishing clubs, the Stuart Fly Rodders and the Stuart Rod and Reel Club that at that time made up the local chapter of the CCA. So I just wanted to acknowledge them. Who likes to eat oysters? Yeah, me too. You know, I feel bad because we have an employee, part-time employee, who helps collect oyster shell. He's from the Chesapeake Bay. He's from Maryland, and I'll get into that of why we collect oyster shell. But he's collecting all this used oyster shell from restaurants, and unfortunately, I have ruined his taste for oysters. So, but aside from being an important food item, they've also been known and characterized to improve water quality. And I'll show you a slide. The next slide will show you a little bit about that. They also, as reef-forming organisms, this is a nice picture of a small sampling of what an oyster reef could look like. All those oysters are clustered together. So you have oysters attaching on top of other oysters. And that action creates a reef. And the neat thing about oysters is that, or our native species of oyster, the eastern oyster, that we typically eat on the East Coast, they form extensive reefs. And in temperate waters, they are the dominant reef-forming organism. When you go into the tropics, and we're in a very unique area because the Indian River Lagoon straddles the temperate and the subtropics. When we go down into the tropics, and you don't have to go too far in Florida, then we have coral reefs. And then in the tropics, coral reefs are the dominant reef-forming organism. And those reefs help stabilize shorelines. And this is actually, that stabilization is a big part of why we're doing what we're doing. And then also, the reef is habitat. So a lot of different organisms, if you look to the back of your room, you see a representation of a coral reef, and you see all the sort of physical space that a hard structure like a reef can have, where different kinds of organisms can live in and around those nooks and crannies. And oyster reefs do exactly the same thing. Different set of organisms, but they provide a very important habitat that ultimately helps enhance biodiversity in our estuaries. So this is a time-lapse video of how oysters, that demonstrates how oysters can improve water quality. So oysters are filter feeders. When they're in the water, making their living, growing and eating, they're filtering out microscopic algae, or phytoplankton, as we like to call them. And in the process of eating, they're clearing the water. There's been estimates that when John Smith first sailed in the Chesapeake Bay, the existing oyster reefs were capable of filtering the entire volume of the Chesapeake Bay in less than 5 days. So unfortunately, the current state of oyster reefs in the Chesapeake Bay, they've estimated that it takes over a year to do that now. Of course, the good side of that story is those kinds of things have really galvanized the Chesapeake Bay states to really push to restore oysters, and there's been a lot of gains made in recent years. So this is a demonstration of how important they can filter and clean the water. An individual adult oyster can filter anywhere from 25 to 50 gallons of water per day. So, 50 gallons is basically a bathtub. So oyster reefs are a very important habitat in the Indian River Lagoon. And when I say the Indian River Lagoon, in our area, in the southern Indian River Lagoon, I'm also including the St. Lucie River, or sometimes we call the St. Lucie Estuary. The St. Lucie Estuary is part of the southern Indian River Lagoon. And the other important estuarine habitat is across the entire Indian River Lagoon, just like oysters, are seagrasses. Seagrass beds are important habitat for fish, especially as a nursery habitat. Oyster reefs are important nursery habitat as well. Again, they are a foundation species, or what we might call a keystone species, where they provide habitat that provides homes for many different organisms. The seagrasses are also food for things like a manatee. And so that has a very important effect on also enhancing biodiversity. And this idea of biodiversity is very important in the Indian River Lagoon, because the Indian River Lagoon is sort of perennially known as the most biodiverse estuary in North America. Well over 4,000 species have been documented in the Indian River Lagoon. And there isn't, it really is, as far as the estuaries in the North America, it really is one of our jewels, And the seagrass beds, have because of that effect on creating habitat, the effect that it can have on the beneficial effect it can have on fisheries. They estimated that the economic value of a seagrass bed is can be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 per acre. So this is really important. And in recent years, if you've been here over the last, I think, 7 years, or the last 10 years, you might be aware of the different challenges the Indian River Lagoon has faced, not just both oyster reefs and seagrass beds. Both seagrass beds and oyster reefs form what is known as essential fish habitat. And I mentioned nursery habitat. The essential nursery habitat is a form of essential fish habitat where it provides habitat or waters and substrate necessary to fish for spawning, breeding, or growth to maturity. So when I mentioned nursery habitat, that is a component of this essential fish habitat designation that is ascribed to a number of Indian River Lagoon habitats, oyster reefs, not just oyster reefs and seagrass, but also mangroves and nearshore reefs or shallow water reefs that you see on the right, such as sabellarid worm reefs. That's a picture from Bathtub Beach in Stewart. If you've ever been there, it's a beautiful place, by the way. I mentioned the challenges that these habitats have faced. An example of that is shown here with oyster reefs. This is going back to about 1940, this is the extent of living oyster reefs in the St. Lucie River. Fast forward 20 years, there's been some loss, another 20, almost 20 years. By 1996, this was the extent of documented living oyster reef in the St. Lucie River. And that historical loss is about a little bit greater than 80%. And what's interesting about that 80% is just within our own estuary, or this is the St. Lucie River and the Southern Indian River Lagoon, that 80% represents a global loss of oyster reefs that have been documented up to 85%. And that 85% actually makes oyster reefs one of the most imperiled marine habitats in the world. So things like this have really motivated different coastal areas to restore oyster reefs because they recognize the value that this organism has and the habitats that they create. So in Florida and many of our other coastal states, there are a number of oyster restoration programs that are trying to restore this important habitat. Seagrasses, if you recall, in 2000, starting I think about 2010, we had these freezes. And we had some die-off of seagrass, which you would typically expect in the wintertime. But the following years, we had some very extensive and severe algal blooms. And those algal blooms shaded a lot of the water in the central and north Indian River Lagoon and prevented seagrasses from being able to recover. And that drop in seagrass area right here represents a loss of over about 47,000 acres in the central and north Indian River Lagoon. I mentioned earlier that they've estimated that the economic value of an acre of seagrass is $5,000 to $10,000. So you can do the math and realize how economically important seagrass beds are to our economy, not just the ecology, but our economy as well. One of the culprits that impacts oysters and seagrass in the southern Indian River Lagoon are freshwater discharges. The previous graph that I showed you was seagrass loss in the central and northern Indian River Lagoon, which were caused mainly by algal blooms. But in our area, in where I work is mainly Martin County, we get a lot of these freshwater discharges that impact our estuary. And this is, if you don't know where this is Sailfish Point, and coming out this way is the St. Lucie Inlet. So this is the ocean right here. So you see this plume of dark water that has originated upstream in the St. Lucie River in the South Fork, or coming from the C-44 canal that is connected to Lake Okeechobee and has traveled downstream. And so this is a example of how severe it can get. And in 2013 and 2016, we had very severe freshwater discharges. And this past year, in 2016, about 10 months of discharges, about 218 billion gallons of fresh water were discharged into the St. Lucie River and southern Indian River Lagoon. The 2013 discharges actually are what precipitated a lot of the work that I'm going to describe to you. It allowed us to create this program that we had named the Northern Estuaries Resource Recovery Program. Northern estuaries are actually the St. Lucie Estuary and the Caloosahatchee River Estuary. And those are considered the northern estuaries of the Everglades. And the idea behind this restoration program was not only restoration and recovery of lost resources that we experienced in 2013, where in the southern Indian River Lagoon, we had pretty much lost all of our oysters in the St. Lucie River. And in the areas that were impacted by those discharges, as they were leaving the St. Lucie River, they were documented up to 75% loss of seagrass in those areas. So this program was designed to not only restore and recover those lost resources, but also to design our program so that we could incorporate some resilience in those habitat restorations. How can we protect or buffer against these kinds of events in the future? I'm showing the historical extent of oyster reefs that you've seen here, and the blues are actually the currently mapped oyster reefs. And then these symbols here are where oyster restoration projects have taken place in recent years. But there's very little that's been done in these downstream areas of the St. Lucie River and going into the southern Indian River Lagoon. And can these downstream areas, if we cite our restoration areas, can these provide a refuge from future discharges? And will that in effect increase the resiliency of this system to these potentially future impacts? But the oyster habitat in these areas are at least currently, are very sparse. Sometimes we have some small patch reefs, intertidal patch reefs. Mangrove prop roots are also a good substrate for oysters. But there really aren't any extensive reefs like we see upstream in the St. Lucie River, and even historic reefs that are upstream in the north and even in the South Fork. These downstream areas are typically are higher salinity. And in our higher salinity areas, and it's been documented in different areas of the country, your high salinity areas where you're nearing oceanic salinities, those reefs natural reefs are more successful as intertidal structures. So if you've ever been to South Carolina and the Low Country and seen those tidal marshes, those are all intertidal reefs. Even as close as St. Augustine, you can see a lot of those kinds of reefs. So these really so that's the other reason why we're doing this shallow water work, is because we have a kind of a dearth of intertidal habitat. The other aspect of our program is we're trying to incorporate resilience in this system to buffer against any future impacts like freshwater discharges. Also, there is this need for what we call living shorelines. And living shorelines, I'll describe that in a few later slides, but they are a little bit more comprehensive shoreline restorations that include oyster reefs. And living shorelines are touted as a potential solution to deal with a loss of shoreline due to erosion and sea level rise. We had actually recruited private homeowners, people that had come forward and asked us, what can we do? Is there something we can do? And we had actually recruited them to see if they'd be interested in putting habitat along their shorelines. And this is a site plan, a proposed site plan of one of those sites. This is an area here. It was really interesting. Hopefully you can see that a little bit. These sort of polygons here, these semicircular polygons, are planned oyster reefs. These green squares, modeled green squares, are where we had hoped to plant seagrass. Okay. So, and this is a private property. On the other side of Indian River Drive is actually a motel in Jensen Beach. You can see where we're putting, in this case, where we're putting this, planning these restorations in relation to their dock. So we have a couple examples of that where the homeowners actually have boat lifts on their dock, but we're well inshore of that. It's a delicate balance because we're trying to restore intertidal habitat, restore and enhance intertidal habitat, but at the same time balancing users, citizens' concerns about things like that, like access and boating. So these combined oyster and seagrass restoration sites allowed us to create about seven of these sites. And they're shown here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 in the green and another 3 in orange. What's interesting about the green ones is those are all those private homeowner or property owner sites. So those are property owners that have waterfront that basically volunteered to allow us to establish and enhance habitat along their shoreline. The other 3 are public sites that we partnered with Martin County on, and they had their priorities to protect the parts of those shorelines against erosion. And so those 4 sites really are one other example of community support that we've gained from those homeowners to allow this to happen and allow us to permit those sites. The other part of it, as I mentioned earlier, are our volunteers. And as I mentioned that term, living shoreline. Well, what is a living shoreline? It is a shoreline protection project, and what we're trying to do is replicate or recreate natural shoreline elements that we would have typically seen on a natural shoreline, such as oyster reefs, seagrass, and native shoreline vegetation. And the idea is to protect the shoreline, but at the same time enhance the habitat value of that particular shoreline. So this is a cross-section of a traditional, or what might be a conceptual sketch of a living shoreline. And typically, just offshore of the shore, you might have what is listed here as a living breakwater. In our case, in the estuary, it would be an oyster reef. So we construct an oyster reef. The idea is that reef structure would stabilize the shoreline shoreward of it, and that would allow us to plant and establish native shoreline vegetation that as those reefs stabilize that shoreline, those plantings can then in turn grow roots and help stabilize that shoreline even further. Another component that can be added in are submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, or seagrass. And those seagrass can then also act to help stabilize those sediments around that area. The role of the homeowner in this case is, even though they don't own the bottom, we saw those waterfront property owners as partners. So we wanted to engage them and get their support before we even decided to apply for a permit. So we actually asked for letters of support that we packaged as part of our permit application, so that when the application was submitted, it was already established that the sites that we were proposing already had support from the people that lived on the upland part of that area. Why do we do this? Living shoreline, as I said earlier, it's a shoreline protection method, so to speak, that can reduce wave energy and erosion, help stabilize that shoreline. It can have some beneficial effects on improving water quality because you have an area of catchment, of runoff, and living habitat that can actually take up and utilize nutrients. Again, you're creating habitats, so you're enhancing biodiversity and therefore the ecological or ecosystem services that those habitats provide. And ultimately, what we hope is this is going to increase resiliency to storm damage and sea level rise. So this idea of resiliency, when we're working on these downstream areas, we're looking at resiliency in 2 ways. One, in our specific area, to increase habitat resiliency or ecosystem resiliency by siting these restorations further away from the source of those discharges, and at the same time increasing the resiliency of those shorelines through living shoreline restoration to future impacts, or really ongoing impacts of erosion and sea level rise. And here's an example. This is a really nice example of some work that was done in Tampa a number of years ago now. And you can see this is pre-restoration. In that intermediate period between the before and after, they had installed oyster reefs, constructed oyster reefs, and then also planted marsh grass behind those reefs. And after about, I guess that's a little over 2 years, you can see the growth of those grasses protected by those reefs. And when you see that waterward expansion of that grass, what you're really seeing is an expansion of that shoreline. And that's what we hope to achieve with living shoreline restoration. And the way that we build those oyster reefs, and this is kind of going back to our core program with oyster restoration, is through this shell recycling program. And I mentioned that I kind of ruined our employees' taste for oysters, unfortunately. And he collects oyster shell from about 8 different restaurants in Martin County. St. Lucie County also has their own program, and they're collecting from, I think, at least 4 or 5 restaurants at this time. That oyster shell is, after it's dried for a period of time, is packaged into mesh bags that we use to create new oyster reefs, shown here. And this is actually one of those private sites. So we got volunteers, took them across the river from FOS to this site, because he's directly across the river, and created these reefs. And this is the end result of that process. So it's all volunteer-driven, volunteer-supported. And in the last year and a half or so, almost 2 years, represented by those 7 sites, we collected about 74 tons of shell. To date, we've collected about 200,000 pounds of shells, so about 100 tons so far, and deployed about just over 11,500 bags of shell. Those bags are about 10 pounds a piece, so it's a lot of shell. In addition to these sites, we also created about 40,000, inclusive of that, we created about 48,000 square feet of oyster reefs. Part of that was a large 1 acre plot that we created in the St. Lucie River with the partnership with Martin County. And as I mentioned, volunteer contributions, well over 1,000 volunteers, each contributing over two hours a piece, so almost 2,500 hours of volunteer service. Actually had some really good settlement on those reefs within the first year, actually within the first month of those reefs, because they were, this particular site, the initial reef construction we did it at just the right time, just the right time.
Magnet, they come.
Right, it's kind of like the Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come, because what the life cycle of an oyster is they have a larval swimming stage. After they're broadcast spawners, the males release sperm, the females release eggs in the water column. They mix, those eggs get fertilized, and then they develop and then metamorphose into a larval stage. That larval stage is about two weeks or so. After that stage, they start to settle down, and they're looking for a place to attach to. And the preferable substrate is other oyster shell. So by putting shell back in the water, we are increasing the potential for that shell to actually turn into living oyster reefs. And so the other, again, I mentioned those newer sites were combined oyster and seagrass restoration sites. This is kind of a newer program for us. And this is this area of seagrass here is actually our gamefish lagoon feature at our coastal center. So we've been planting seagrass in this lagoon since about 2011 or 12. And it's growing quite well. And the program, our newer program, is based on training volunteers on identifying seagrass, different species. The Indian River Lagoon is home to about 7 species of seagrass. So it's one of the, as far as seagrass, it is probably the most diverse area in North America for that. And how we obtain those seagrass is just by collecting fragments that are washed up on the beach. So this is, we're collecting on the outer beach here, but we also collect on inshore beaches. So after a storm event, after high tides, we walk the rack lines and we can find pretty consistently seagrass fragments. And those fragments, when we collect those fragments and weave them into a stabilizing mesh. This is a biodegradable mat made out of coconut fiber. We weave those fragments into that mesh and then plant those mats in another seawater system, a nursery tank system, to get those to grow. And what we found is these fragments are viable. If you can rescue them early enough to where before they dry out in the sun on the rack line, you can actually revive them. They'll grow new roots, and they'll actually do quite well if we can rescue them early enough. And then eventually, we take those mats after that nursery period and plant them. And at that same site, the idea is to recover, replant, and restore. And this is an example of that. This is actually that same oyster reef site that I showed you earlier. And you can see under the water here, you can see that oyster shell here. We're planting the seagrass around that oyster reef. And this is what one of those sites looks like. This is that site in Jensen Beach. It's just north of the Jensen Beach Causeway. And again, as I mentioned earlier, all of these sites are shallow water. They get exposed at low tide. We think that's going to be the better way for those habitats to persist. The seagrasses are either in front of or around. We tried some behind these most waterward reefs, because they will stay in water, some water, even during the low tides. And this is a representation of what these sites will have looked like. This is some of the reefs that we've created. The green symbols are where we've planted seagrass. And I'm going to show you some of the data, initial data that we found on these oyster reefs. This is an example of one of the shells that we found on. In fact, I think it's that exact reef, that site that I showed you earlier, after about a month or so post installation. All those here, these are all baby oysters or spat. And we were very fortunate because we installed those first reefs at the end of April. There was a very high spat fall. Somewhere in between the end of April and about a month later. I think that data is from about the third week of May or so. And we saw very high levels of oyster spat that were finding their way to those reefs. And it was fairly consistent over these sets of months. And when we went back and measured those oysters after a few months, we could see initially some of these reefs, you see what we would expect. We see small spat, and then eventually growth and different sizes of oysters, which is a good thing to see. You have different size classes of oysters. That means they're growing. We're starting to get a healthy population established on those reefs. And when we look at the survival of those, we had some initial death the spat are very vulnerable in that first month of life. But after a few months, we really didn't see hardly any mortality of those oysters. And the densities at some of these sites were incredibly high. I'm showing two different graphs. I had to separate out the data because the site that I showed you that's north of the Jensen Beach Causeway, the densities of oysters on those reefs were so high, this LS01 site, that it kind of swamps out the densities of oysters at some of these younger reefs. You can't really see how many oysters are on those reefs. But so if I separate those out, you can see even though they're much lower, you're still at one of these sites you're getting over 100 oysters per square meter, which is pretty good. Here's an example of what some of those clusters look like. The larger shells are the shells that we put out from our shell recycling program. So you're starting to get oysters settling, attaching to that shell, and growing into these nice clusters. This is all significant because, as you recall, in 2016, with that extreme El Nino event, the second strongest El Nino on record, we had a very high rainfall during our dry season, which initiated a 10-month-long period of freshwater discharges, primarily from Lake Okeechobee. And during that period, we still had high survival of those oysters. Going back to these downstream areas where we have one site south of the Stewart Causeway, two sites in between the two causeways, and then one site north of the Jensen Beach Causeway, Harbor Branch has a really nice, Harbor Branch and Orca have really nice water quality monitoring systems that can track data in real time. This is an example of one of those. And it demonstrates the idea that these downstream sites have actually served as a refuge from these discharges. This is salinity data comparing Jensen Beach, and that station is right around here, so somewhere, and salinity data in the St. Lucie River in two areas, the South Fork and Mid-Estuary, which is near the Roosevelt Bridge. And you can see this is on the left. You just have to believe me. I think the lionfish is in the way here, but right here is fresh water. That's 0 all the way up to 35 parts per thousand, which is full-strength seawater. And you can see the salinities in these downstream areas were stayed high during those periods of discharges. And actually, these salinities are still in the optimal range for oysters. Oysters like salinities that are brackish, so between half to maybe 2/3 strength seawater. And so during those 10-month discharges, when you have salinities that are fresh water and very low at times, we still had higher salinities at these downstream sites. So demonstrating that these downstream areas can be potential refuge sites from when we are getting these discharges. So far, we found that these sites, these downstream sites, are unaffected by the discharges, and we're getting consistent spat settlement at these sites, and high survival, and very high densities. This is and good growth in multiple size classes, which is a good sign that these reefs are on their way to being successful. Hopefully, over the long period, we're going to keep continuing to monitor these reefs as we go along. This is what those reefs north of the Jensen Beach Causeway. That's what they look like about 7 months after we first installed these reefs. You can see these are all clusters of oysters. They're all cemented together, so all those shell that was in those bags, I was just there last week, and I tried to move them. I can't move them. And all these reefs, all those sites stayed solid during Hurricane Matthew. So that's another good sign that they may be having that effect of helping protect those shorelines. You can see spawning in as little as less than 6 months old oysters, depending on the conditions. What's unique about this site is it's surrounded by a lot of existing oysters that have settled either on a small natural reef or some artificial substrate near there. So they have a source basically right in the vicinity. The other sites, not so much, but we are still seeing spat settlement on those sites as well. This one has just been really incredibly successful. The other thing that was significant about this area is as you all remember, we got those blue-green algae blooms in July. And some of that did make its way up, but they're more of a freshwater organism. And even though we did get blue-green algae that made its way all the way to our outer beaches and at some of these sites, we didn't detect any what would have looked like effects of the blue-green algae on the oysters. So they made it through those events as well. As I mentioned, we're going to try to keep monitoring these sites to see how persistent they can be in the long term. We're looking at things like not only growth and recruitment and survival, but also looking at the physical reef structure and its influence on shoreline protection. Are we able to maintain that intertidal exposure that I think is very important for the long-term persistence of these reefs? Another thing that we're looking at is how they are functioning to accrete or gain sediment around those reefs. And we're applying some techniques that are actually adapted from wetland and marsh ecology. This is an honors college student that's doing this as part of his honors college thesis at FAU. And looking at water levels to see, you know, are we able to maintain this intertidal environment for these reefs, or are the oyster reefs able to keep pace with any rises in sea level over time and still remain intertidal? So we're at a few of those sites we're looking at water levels to sort of determine the percentage of time those oysters can remain intertidal. And this is the other reason why intertidal reefs might be very important, is because one thing we've noticed is a lot more potential predators on some of these reefs. This is the Florida rock snail, and they can feed on baby oysters. In some of our sites, we're seeing a lot of these, you know, like over a dozen per reef. So those might have long-term effects over time. A lot of this is fairly new. The whole concept of living shorelines is fairly new, and it is an effort. If you can think of it as green infrastructure, a nature-based defense solution to deal with erosion, sea level rise, and loss of habitat. But really, this idea of humans altering their environment to enhance it is really quite old. This is an example of what is called a clam garden. This is in the Pacific Northwest. These are structures that were built by our early coastal Native Americans. And they consist of almost a breakwater or sill-type structure. And what they were trying to do was basically create an area where water can be impounded and create these areas where they can actually, in fact, they were farming clams. They knew way back then that they can do things that can help enhance their environment, and in this case, for their food supply. You know, so we're trying to do this for different reasons. What they found, which is really interesting, is in these clam gardens, when they actually took baby clams from a hatchery and they seeded areas within these clam gardens and compared them to areas where they seeded that were not clam gardens, they actually found the clams grew to higher densities. It grew faster in these clam garden areas. So even back then, early Native Americans knew that there are ways that they could alter their environment for their benefit. And so I go back to this because so this whole idea of building these living shorelines really isn't a new concept. It's really something that we've done as humans for generations. And I can only imagine that these areas, these clam gardens, I imagine them as the tribe getting together to build those environments as a community, in very much the same way that we are now trying to do this as a community. With that, I thank you for your time.